Rome, February 17th, 1600. A man stands in a market square, bound to a wooden stake. The fire has not yet been lit. In these final seconds, the square is almost quiet. The way places go quiet when something is about to happen that everyone present will carry with them for the rest of their lives. The man at the centre of it is 52 years old. He has been in prison for 7 years. Before that, he spent 15 years moving across Europe from one city to the next, carrying an idea that no institution on the continent was willing to permanently house. This morning, they have given him one last chance to put the idea down. Later accounts, drawn primarily from a letter written by a witness named Gaspar Schopp to a colleague in the days following the execution, emphasized that Bruno met the sentence without visible collapse, that he turned his face away from the crucifix offered to him at the end, and that he said nothing the record has preserved as a final recantation. What those same accounts described was a man who had already finished his argument, long before this morning, in the years of his cell and the decades of his road, and who had arrived at this square with nothing left to take back. His name was Giordano Bruno. He was born in a small town at the foot of a volcano in southern Italy, entered a monastery at 17, and spent the next 35 years following a single question wherever it led, through the libraries of Naples, the courts of Paris and London, the prisons of Venice and Rome, and finally to this square on a February morning when the answer he had arrived at was still the answer he refused to surrender. Tonight we follow the full arc of that life. Let the noise of the day fall away. Settle in. This is the story of a man who looked up at the night sky and could not stop asking what was out there, and of a world that was not yet ready for what he found. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Looked Us Up. Nola, Kingdom of Naples. Around 1548. There is a mountain to the north that the people of this region have lived beside for as long as memory reaches, and the mountain is not entirely trustworthy. Vesuvius sits on the horizon, the way certain kinds of knowledge sit at the back of the mind, present always, occasionally rumbling, capable at any moment of becoming something that cannot be ignored. The people of Nola had learned to live with that presence the way people learn to live with most things that cannot be changed. They built their houses, they planted their fields, they went to church on Sundays and prayed to a God they trusted was watching over the mountain as carefully as he was watching over them. Into this world, sometime around 1548, a boy was born whose father was a soldier named Giordano Bruno, and whose mother was a woman named Frolissa Savellino. They named him Filippo. He was small, and by all later accounts, unusually alert from the beginning, the kind of child who notices things that other children walk past without seeing. The town of Nola sits in the Campanian plain southeast of Naples, and in the 16th century it was a place of deep Catholic tradition where the rhythms of the church organized the rhythms of daily life so completely that the two were essentially indistinguishable. The bells told you when to wake, and when to pray, and when to eat, and when to sleep. The priests were among the most educated men most people would ever encounter. The boundaries of what could be safely thought and safely said were understood by everyone, not because they were written on walls, but because they had been absorbed over generations into the way the community understood itself. Filippo Bruno grew up inside those boundaries, the way all children grow up inside the world they are born into, without at first understanding that the boundaries are boundaries, and not simply the shape of reality itself. But there was the sky. He wrote about it later, in the way that people write about the experiences of childhood that marked them before they had language for what was happening. He described lying on his back in the fields outside Nola as a boy and looking up at the night sky with a question forming in him that he could not yet put into words. The stars were very bright in Campania in the 16th century, in a way that is difficult to imagine now, before the electric light of modern cities pushed the darkness back. On a clear night, you could see thousands of them, the bright ones and the faint ones, and the ones so numerous they blurred together into the pale band that crossed the sky from horizon to horizon. He looked at them and he wanted to know what they were, not in the sense that a child wants to know the name of a thing. In the deeper sense, he wanted to know what they actually were, what they were made of, how far away they were, whether there was something on the other side of them, whether the sky had an edge, and if it did, what was beyond that edge. These were not questions with easy answers in 1548. The standard answer, the one that virtually every educated person in Europe accepted, was that the earth sat at the centre of the universe, that the sun and the moon and the planets moved around it in perfect crystalline spheres, and that beyond the outermost sphere was the realm of God and the angels. The stars were lights fixed into that outermost sphere, decorations on the ceiling of a cosmos designed specifically as a home for human beings. It was a beautiful picture, orderly, purposeful, and it placed humanity at the centre of everything. Filippo looked at the sky and felt that the picture was not big enough. He could not have told you why at the age of 10 or 12. He had only the feeling, persistent and unshakable, that what he was looking at was larger than the story he had been given about it, and feelings of that particular kind, the ones that arrive before language and stay after every argument against them has been exhausted, have a way of organizing a life around themselves without asking permission. His father sent him to Naples to study when he was around 15 years old. Naples in the 1560s was one of the largest cities in Europe, a crowded and magnificent and deeply contradictory place. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Naples, ruled at the time by Spain, and it contained within its walls an extraordinary mixture of learning and repression, of humanist scholars and Inquisition tribunals, of ancient libraries and public burnings of books the authorities had decided were dangerous. It was a city where you could walk in the morning past a university where Aristotle was being debated in Latin, and walk in the afternoon past a public execution of someone whose ideas had been judged incompatible with the faith. For a boy from Nola with a question that would not leave him alone, Naples was both an opportunity and a warning. He began his formal education with private tutors in logic and Latin and the humanities. The standard curriculum for a young man of modest means who showed intellectual promise. He absorbed everything quickly. His memory, which would become famous later in his life, was already remarkable. He read everything he could find. He argued with his teachers in the way that certain kinds of students argue, not to show off, but because they genuinely cannot accept an answer that does not fully satisfy the question. In Naples, for the first time, he began to find other people asking questions that pointed in the same direction as his own, toward a universe that might be more vast, more strange, more indifferent to human convenience than the tidy picture that had been taught for centuries. He was 15 years old, newly arrived in a city that was too large and too dangerous and too full of ideas for anyone to navigate with, without eventually choosing which kind of person they were going to be. He was choosing already. By following the question wherever it pointed and refusing to stop when it pointed somewhere uncomfortable, the mountain was on the horizon behind him. The sky above the city at night was full of the same stars he had been looking at from the fields of Nola, and the question had not changed at all. It had only gotten larger. Chapter 2. The Dominican and the Doubt. Naples, 1565. The library of San Domenico Maggiore had a silence that belonged to very few rooms in the world. It was the silence of accumulated thought, of thousands of books standing in the half-dark, each one containing the compressed lifetime of a mind that had long since stopped breathing, walking through it in the early morning, before the other monks were fully awake, before the bells called everyone to the first prayers of the day. The young man who had recently been given the name Giordano felt something he would spend years trying to describe, and never quite managed to put into words precisely enough to satisfy himself. He felt that the room was alive, not in any mystical sense, or not only in a mystical sense, in the practical sense that every book on those shelves was a conversation waiting to happen, an argument made centuries ago by someone who had looked at the world with full attention and written down what they found. The library was a record of human looking, and for a young man from Nola who had been looking at the sky since childhood and finding the standard explanations insufficient, it was the closest thing to paradise he had encountered. He had entered the monastery of San Domenico Maggiore at around 17 years old, which was not unusual for the time and the place. His family did not have the resources to send him to a university. The monastery had a library that most universities would have envied. The calculation was not complicated. What was more complicated was the question of faith. Bruno was not, as far as the historical record allows us to judge, a person without religious feeling. The scholars who have examined his life most carefully, including Ingrid Rowland, whose biography of Bruno, published in 2008, draws on the most comprehensive reading of the primary sources available, suggest that his relationship with the divine was genuine and deep, but that it was also, from the beginning, his own. He did not experience God the way the Dominican order required its members to experience God. He experienced something larger and stranger, something that did not fit neatly inside the doctrinal containers the Church had spent centuries constructing. But he was 17, and the library was magnificent, and for the first several years inside San Domenico, he kept the misfit quality of his religious imagination mostly to himself. The Dominican order had a particular history and a particular character that shaped everything about life inside its walls. It had been founded in the 13th century explicitly as an order of preachers, men trained to defend the faith through argument and persuasion. The Dominicans valued intellect. They valued debate. They had produced Thomas Aquinas, the greatest systematic theologian of the medieval world, a man whose work had attempted to reconcile the entire philosophical tradition of ancient Greece with the doctrines of Christianity. For a young man who loved argument and who was constitutionally incapable of accepting any proposition without testing it against every objection he could construct, the Dominican intellectual tradition was genuinely exciting. These were people who believed that truth could survive scrutiny. They had been asking hard questions for 300 years. What they were less prepared for was a novice who asked questions the tradition itself could not answer. Bruno's memory was extraordinary from the beginning, and he developed it deliberately using techniques drawn from the ancient art of memory, a classical tradition of mental organization that the Renaissance had recently revived. The basic principle was architectural. You imagined a building you knew well, and you placed the things you wanted to remember at specific locations within it, so that when you needed to recall something, you simply walked through the building in your mind and picked it up from where you had left it. Bruno's version went considerably further. He developed a system of extraordinary complexity, using not just spatial memory, but symbolic associations, rotating wheels of images and concepts that could be combined and recombined to generate new connections between ideas. His memory system would later become one of the things he was most famous for across Europe, attracting the attention of kings and scholars who wanted to understand how a single mind could hold and organize so much. Inside the monastery, it simply meant that he remembered everything he read and could hold a dozen arguments in his head simultaneously, turning them against each other to see which ones survived. He read Thomas Aquinas and found the architecture impressive and the foundations worth questioning. He read Aristotle and found him brilliant and incomplete. He read the Neoplatonists and found in their vision of a universe animated by a single divine intelligence something that resonated more deeply with what he felt when he looked at the sky than anything the standard curriculum had offered. And then he found Copernicus. The copy of De Revolutionibus that circulated in the library of San Domenico existed in that particular category of books present in institutional libraries because serious scholars needed access to them. But that came with the implicit understanding they were to be handled carefully. The Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus had died 20 years earlier and had published, in the year of his death, a book arguing that the earth moved around the sun rather than the sun around the earth. He had framed his argument as a mathematical model that made calculations of planetary movement more elegant and precise. He had dedicated the book to the Pope. He had done everything he could to present a dangerous idea in the least dangerous possible way. Bruno read it and understood immediately that the carefulness was a kind of intellectual restraint, not a failing exactly, but a stopping short of where the argument actually pointed. Because if the earth really moved around the sun, the implications did not end where Copernicus had ended them. Bruno lay awake at night in his cell and followed those implications the way a man follows a thread in the dark, not knowing exactly where it leads, but unable to put it down. If the earth moves around the sun is at the centre. But why should the sun be special among all the points of light in the sky? What if it is not special at all? What if every star is itself a sun, burning at the centre of its own system of worlds, each of those worlds as real and as solid as the earth beneath his feet? And if that is true, the universe has no centre. And if it has no centre, it has no edge either, because an edge implies something beyond it. And if there is something beyond it, the edge is not really an edge. And if it has no edge, it is infinite. He was in his early 20s, lying on a narrow bed in a monastery in Naples, and the picture assembling itself in his mind was one that the institution around him was structurally incapable of accommodating. He did not say it out loud. Not yet. He carried it through the years of his novitiate, through his ordination as a priest around 1572, through his continuing studies in theology and philosophy. He carried it the way a person carries something they are not ready to show anyone, but cannot bring themselves to put down. The monastery was a place of extraordinary intellectual richness, and simultaneously a place of extraordinary intellectual constraint. The same walls that gave him access to Copernicus and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas also contained the mechanisms of enforcement that the Dominican order had developed over centuries. The Dominicans were not only scholars, they were also the order most closely associated with the Inquisition, with the systematic identification and correction of ideas that deviated from church teaching. Bruno understood this. He was not naive about where he lived. The problems accumulated slowly and then quickly. Small ones at first, questions he asked in theological discussions that his superiors found unsettling, books found in his cell with their officially required prefaces removed, a reputation growing slowly for being brilliant and unreliable in the same breath. Then, larger problems. He was heard expressing doubts about certain foundational doctrines, the Trinity, the nature of Christ, the kind of doubts that, reported to the wrong person, would result in formal investigation. He was not formally investigated. Not yet. But the machinery of institutional attention had begun to turn in his direction, slowly, gathering evidence and waiting for the threshold that required action. He understood what was happening. In 1576, with a formal charge of heresy beginning to form around him, Giordano Bruno removed the Dominican habit, put on secular clothes, and walked out of San Domenico Maggiore without permission from his superiors. He was 28 years old. He had spent 11 years inside those walls. He had read every book in that library. He had developed a system of memory capable of holding all of it, and he had assembled, quietly and without anyone fully noticing until it was too late, a picture of the cosmos that no monastery wall was large enough to contain. He walked north toward Rome. The picture came with him. Consider for a moment what that walk meant. 11 years inside the same walls, the same bells at the same hours, the same arguments in the same rooms, and inside all of that, a vision of the universe assembling itself in one man's mind that the rest of the world would take 3 centuries to catch up to, not because he was given special tools or special access, because he followed the question further than anyone around him was willing to follow it, and he could not make himself stop. The night outside the monastery walls was very dark. The stars were out. He walked toward them. Chapter 3. The Idea that Changed Everything. Rome, 1576. He arrived in Rome and found it indifferent, which was probably the best he could have hoped for. He spent several months there doing small work as a private tutor, keeping his most dangerous ideas relatively quiet, presenting himself as a scholar of memory and philosophy rather than as someone with views that would get him arrested. It did not work well enough. The investigation forming around him in Naples followed him north. He learned that formal charges were being prepared. He left Rome, and so began 15 years of wandering. Before we follow him on that road, we need to stop here and spend real time with the idea itself, not a summary of it, the full version, with the weight it actually carried, because without understanding what Bruno reached toward, you cannot understand what it cost him to keep reaching. Start with a specific evening. Imagine him in his cell in San Domenico, sometime in his early 20s, after the other monks have gone to sleep. The candle is low. The book in his hands is Copernicus. Outside the window, the Naples sky is clear, and the stars are out. the same stars he has been looking at since he was a boy in Nola, and something is happening in his mind that he will spend the rest of his life trying to describe. He is reading about a universe where the earth moves around the sun. He sets the book down, he looks at the window, and then, in the way that certain ideas arrive not as conclusions but as openings, as the sudden awareness that a door you did not know existed has come unlocked, he begins to follow the thought somewhere Copernicus never went. Copernicus had moved the earth and left everything else in place. The sun was at the centre. The stars were still fixed in their distant sphere. The universe was still finite. God was still in his place, beyond the outermost boundary. But Bruno looks at the stars through his window and asks the question Copernicus did not ask. Why should the stars be fixed in a sphere? When you look at the night sky, some stars burn intensely and some are barely visible. If they were all attached to the same sphere at the same distance, why would they look different? The answer that arrives, with the quiet force of something that has always been true and is only now being seen, is that they are not all at the same distance. Some are closer and some are further away, which means they are not attached to a sphere at all, which means there is no sphere. And if there is no sphere, then how far does space extend? He follows the thread. If space extends in every direction, with no boundary, and if the stars are distributed through it at varying distances, then there is no reason to suppose that the stars we can see are all the stars that exist. There might be stars beyond the range of human vision, further away than any instrument could detect. There might be, in the dark, beyond the dark, an infinite number of them. And here is where the thought becomes something he has never encountered before. If every star is a sun, then our sun is not unique. It is one among an enormous number of objects of the same kind, each one burning at the centre of its own system of worlds, which means the earth, circling our particular sun, is not unique either. It is one world among a potentially infinite number, each one circling its own sun in its own region of an infinite dark. He sits with this for a long time. No centre, no edge, no special location where God arranged the furniture of the cosmos with humanity in the most prominent chair. The candle burns down. Outside the window, the stars do what they have always done. What he is feeling in this moment is not triumph. It is closer to the feeling described by people who have looked over the edge of something very high and understood, for the first time, both the distance to the bottom and the fact that they are not afraid of it. A kind of vertiginous clarity. The universe is not the size of the story he was given. It is not the size of any story. It is the size of itself, which is to say, it is without size, without edge, without centre, without the need of any human account to make it real. He published the fullest version of this idea in 1584 in a book called Dell'Infinito, Universo e Mondi, on the infinite universe and worlds. He was not hedging. He was not presenting a mathematical model that might or might not correspond to physical reality. He was asserting, with the clarity of a man who has followed an argument to its end and is not willing to round it off, that the universe is infinite and full of worlds. Now, it is important to say something here that is easy to miss in the simpler versions of his story. Bruno was not a scientist in the modern sense. He did not make systematic observations of the night sky. He did not use instruments. He reached toward his cosmological conclusions through philosophical reasoning and intuition, rather than through the kind of empirical investigation that would become the foundation of modern science. His near contemporary Galileo, who was a genuine observational astronomer, was careful to distance himself from Bruno, precisely because he understood that being associated with Bruno's broader philosophy would make it harder to defend his own more carefully grounded claims. What Bruno was a philosophical visionary who reached towards something before the tools to confirm it existed. The scholar Francis Yates, whose work on Bruno in the 1960s and 70s was foundational for later scholarship, identified another dimension of his thought that the simpler stories tend to leave out. His cosmological vision was inseparable from his theological vision. The infinite universe was not just a physical claim, it was a claim about God. If the universe is infinite, God cannot be located outside it in some distant empyrean beyond the outermost sphere. That picture requires a finite universe. Bruno argued instead that the divine principle was expressed through the universe rather than stationed outside it, that the infinite variety of natural things was itself the expression of an infinite intelligence. A God large enough to be present in an infinite universe was, in his reasoning, a greater God than one who needed the cosmos to be small in order to be present in it. This was the part of his thinking that made the institution most uncomfortable, more uncomfortable in some respects than the cosmology itself. He was not simply adjusting the map of the solar system, he was proposing an entirely different account of the relationship between God and the world, one that the existing theological framework could not absorb without dismantling itself in the process. He understood this. He had understood it since those nights in San Domenico when the idea first took its full shape, and he could not put it down. The road north from Rome was long, and he had no particular destination, and the question that had been organizing his life since childhood was now the size of the universe itself, which is to say it was the size of everything, which is to say there was nowhere he could go where it would not be with him. He kept moving. The idea kept moving with him. Two things travelling together through a world that had not yet decided how much it was willing to pay to keep that particular conversation from happening. Chapter 4. The Fugitive Friar. Rome to Paris, 1576 to 1583. The road north, out of Rome, in the autumn of 1576, was not a road that offered much comfort to a man travelling alone, with no institutional backing, and a reputation beginning to precede him in ways he could not entirely control. He moved through Italy in small steps, stopping in towns along the way, doing what he would do for the next 15 years in every city he passed through. He taught, he lectured on memory. He took on private students who wanted to learn his mnemonic system. The elaborate architecture of images and rotating wheels that could hold an extraordinary quantity of information in a single organized mind. He was good enough at this that students sought him out, and the income was enough to keep him moving. He stopped in Nola, a small coastal town in Liguria. He stopped in Savona. He stopped in Turin. Each place offered temporary shelter and the particular loneliness of a man who is always passing through, never arriving anywhere that feels like it might become permanent. He crossed the Alps into Geneva in the spring of 1578, arriving in a city that presented itself, from a distance, as a possible solution. Geneva was the capital of the Calvinist Reformation, the city that John Calvin had shaped in the previous generation into a model of reformed Christian society. It had rejected the authority of Rome. For someone fleeing a heresy charge in Catholic Italy, It seemed like a reasonable destination. Bruno arrived and very quickly discovered that the tolerance of Geneva was precisely calibrated and did not extend to him. The Calvinist intellectual tradition was, in its own way, as tightly controlled as the Dominican one he had left. Calvin himself had burned Michael Servetus at the stake in 1553 for denying the Trinity. The same doctrine Bruno had been heard questioning in Naples. The reformers had not freed themselves from Rome in order to become permissive about theological deviance. They had freed themselves from Rome in order to establish their own version of correctness. Bruno enrolled at the university and almost immediately ran into difficulty. He published a broadsheet criticizing a Calvinist professor, listing what he identified as errors in a single lecture. The Calvinist authorities arrested him. They required him to apologize publicly and withdraw the criticisms. He apologized in the way that a person apologizes when the alternative is worse. Without retracting the underlying assessment, he was released and left Geneva immediately. The experience confirmed something he had perhaps suspected before arriving. There was no version of European Christianity in 1578, Catholic or Protestant, that had space for what he was. The disagreements between Rome and Geneva were real, and in some cases profound. But on the question of whether an individual thinker had the right to follow his own reasoning to its own conclusions, regardless of where that reasoning led, Rome and Geneva were in perfect agreement. He did not agree. He moved to France. The France he entered was a country in the middle of a prolonged religious civil war. The wars of religion between French Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots had been tearing the country apart for 16 years, producing massacres and political assassinations, and the particular kind of social exhaustion that settles over a society that has been fighting about God long enough to have lost track of what the fighting was originally for. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, in which, by most historical estimates, thousands of Protestants were killed in Paris, and tens of thousands more across France in the weeks that followed, was 6 years in the past and still present in everyone's memory. He went first to Toulouse, one of the great university cities of France, where he spent 2 years as a lecturer in philosophy. He taught Aristotle, which was the standard curriculum, and he taught it well enough to earn a formal academic appointment with a salary and a degree of institutional legitimacy he had not had since leaving Naples. The Toulouse years gave him something the road had not: time to write, time to think without the constant pressure of the next city. The next explanation of who he was and why he was there, he used the time the way he always used any interval of stability, not to rest but to build, adding structure and precision to the ideas that had been developing in the fragments of time available to a man who was always about to leave. In 1581 he moved to Paris. Paris was different from every city he had been in since Naples. It was one of the largest cities in Europe, a place of extraordinary intellectual density where the university drew scholars from across the continent. It was also the city of the French royal court, and the court in 1581 was presided over by a king who had a particular interest in the kind of intellectual showmanship at which Bruno excelled. King Henri III of France has been treated harshly by history and deserves at minimum the recognition that he was genuinely curious in an age when genuine curiosity was rarer among rulers than it should have been. He was interested in philosophy, in the question of how human memory and intelligence worked. When he heard about a Dominican friar who had developed a system of memory so powerful he could hold the entire content of a library in a single organized mind. He was interested enough to summon Bruno to court. The meeting was, by the accounts that survive, a success. Bruno demonstrated his memory techniques before the king and his court. Performing feats of recall, his audience found extraordinary. Henri offered him a position as a reader at the royal court, a paid appointment that gave him financial stability, social protection, and access to the most powerful intellectual network in France. For the first time since leaving Naples, Bruno had room to breathe. He used the room, he wrote, he lectured, he developed his ideas with an energy the years of constant movement had been consuming without leaving enough behind for the work itself. The Paris years, from 1581 to 1583, were among the most productive of his life up to that point. Books on memory that would circulate across Europe, lectures that drew serious scholars, a reputation that was growing in the direction he needed it to grow. And here is a moment worth pausing on, because it speaks directly to something that matters for us today. Bruno in Paris, in 1582, was 40 years old. He had been running for 6 years. He had been building his philosophical vision since he was a teenager in Naples. And here, finally, in this city, in this court, he had a room of his own and a salary and people who wanted to hear what he thought. Most people, given that room after 6 years of running, would have softened the edges of the argument, would have learned, from the years of being pushed out of every city, to present the dangerous parts of the idea in ways that made them easier to accept, would have become, gradually and without entirely noticing, a slightly safer version of themselves. Bruno did the opposite. The stability of Paris gave him not the incentive to be more careful, but the capacity to be more precise, to articulate the full scope of what he had reached toward more clearly than he had been able to articulate it on the road. The room and the salary did not buy his accommodation, they bought his clarity. By 1583, the political situation in Paris had deteriorated enough that Henri could no longer afford the cost of protecting a thinker whose reputation for heterodoxy was becoming too visible. Bruno understood when it was time to move before being pushed, and he accepted an opportunity that took him to the one city in Europe where he might work with the greatest possible freedom. He crossed the Channel. He was going to London. The sea crossing was rough. He arrived on the other side, wet and cold, and entirely alive, and carrying in his head the books he had not yet written, the ones that would still be read 4 centuries later, in a world he could not have imagined from the deck of that boat. The Thames was ahead. The story was about to enter its most extraordinary chapter. Chapter 5. The London Years and the Books that Shook Europe. London, 1583 to 1585. The city Giordano Bruno arrived in during the spring of 1583 was loud and crowded and full of a kind of energy that was different from anything he had encountered on the continent. The theatres were already there. The improvised wooden structures on the south bank of the Thames, where crowds gathered in the afternoons to watch performances that mixed high rhetoric with low comedy in ways that would have appalled the academic establishments of Paris, and Oxford simultaneously. The taverns were dense with argument and the particular energy of a city figuring out, in real time and without a clear map, what it meant to be a Protestant nation in a Catholic Europe. What London offered that no city on the continent could offer in 1583 was a specific kind of political shelter. England under Queen Elizabeth I had separated from Rome in the previous generation, and the separation had produced a religious settlement that was, by the standards of the time, unusually pragmatic. The Church of England was Protestant in its rejection of papal authority, but conservative in its liturgy and structure, and the political culture around it had a higher tolerance for foreign intellectuals with unusual views than anywhere Bruno had been since leaving Naples. Not unlimited tolerance. England had its own heresy laws, but the Catholic Inquisition did not operate there, and a man who was careful about where he expressed his most dangerous opinions had more room to work than he had had anywhere else. Bruno came to London under the protection of Michel de Castelnau, the French ambassador to England, a man of broad intellectual sympathies, who had encountered Bruno in Paris and recognized in him something worth protecting. He lived in the French embassy on Butcher Row, which gave him diplomatic shelter in addition to the more general protection of being in England. And for the next 2 years, the embassy was the base from which he ventured out into London intellectual life with a freedom he had not previously experienced as an adult. He went to Oxford. The University of Oxford, in 1583, was one of the most ancient and prestigious seats of learning in the Protestant world, and the scholars who occupied its chairs regarded themselves, with some justification, as the intellectual inheritors of a tradition refined over centuries into something of considerable rigour and self-confidence. They were not men who welcomed challenges to the foundations of what they taught. Bruno arrived at Oxford and immediately challenged the foundations. He gave a series of lectures during his time at Oxford in which he presented the Copernican cosmology and his own extension of it, the infinite universe with its infinite suns and worlds, to an audience of Oxford scholars who had not invited him to do this and who were not pleased to find themselves being lectured on the inadequacy of their understanding of the cosmos by an Italian former monk with no institutional affiliation. The response was hostile. Bruno left Oxford without having converted a single scholar to his position, with the additional irritation of having been accused of presenting ideas taken from other sources as his own, a charge he denied and resented for the rest of his life. But the debates were not a failure in the way that matters most. He had stood in one of the most conservative intellectual environments in Protestant Europe and made his argument without flinching, and the argument was now in the air, available to work on the people who had heard it in the months and years that followed. He returned to London and he wrote. The 2 years in London produced a series of books that represent the fullest and most powerful expression of his philosophical vision. They were written in Italian rather than Latin, in a conversational and often passionate prose, very different from the dry academic Latin in which serious philosophy was supposed to be conducted. They were structured as dialogues, in the tradition of Plato, with characters representing different positions, arguing out the questions Bruno considered most important. The Ash Wednesday Supper, published in 1584, was the first of them. It described a dinner conversation at which Bruno, represented by one of the dialogue characters, defends the Copernican system against scholars who challenge it. The philosophical argument is rigorous, but the setting is deliberately grounded in the physical reality of London, with descriptions of the streets and the weather and the social awkwardness of the gathering that give the abstract cosmological debate an unusual texture of lived experience. He was making philosophy visceral, pulling it out of the realm of pure abstraction and into the world of cold evenings and muddy streets, and people who disagreed with each other around a table. On the Cause, Principle and Unity, published the same year, developed the philosophical dimension of his vision, arguing for a universe animated by a single underlying principle expressing itself through infinite variety. On the Infinite Universe and Worlds, also published in 1584, was the most direct statement of the cosmological argument. The universe is infinite. It contains an infinite number of worlds. Each star is a sun. Each sun may have worlds circling it. The cosmos has no centre and no edge. Written in Italian, dedicated to the French ambassador who was sheltering him, circulated across Europe within months of publication. He also published the Heroic Frenzies during these years, a meditation on the experience of the philosopher who pursues truth past the point where it is comfortable or safe. He described the heroic frenzied thinker as someone seized by an impulse toward infinite understanding, someone driven always toward the larger picture, always toward the further horizon, always toward the sun itself rather than its reflection in still water. He was writing about himself, with a degree of self-awareness that makes the text almost uncomfortable to read, because you can see in it that he understood exactly what he was doing, that the pursuit he was describing was the pursuit that was going to cost him everything, and that this knowledge did not slow him down by a single step. The London books circulated across Europe through the networks of scholars and diplomats who moved between courts and universities. The responses they generated were polarized in the way that genuinely radical ideas tend to generate polarized responses. Some scholars found them extraordinary, others found them dangerous, precisely because the vision was coherent and compelling and led to conclusions that no orthodox theological framework could accommodate. The months in London also gave Bruno something the years of running had not provided: a degree of social integration into the intellectual life of a city that valued argument and was curious about the world. He moved in circles that included scholars, poets, courtiers, and diplomats. John Florio, who documented Italian culture for English audiences and later produced major translations of Montaigne, was part of the broader intellectual world Bruno inhabited during these years, though the precise nature of their contact remains a matter of scholarly discussion rather than settled record. Philip Sidney, one of the central figures of Elizabethan literary culture and a serious reader of natural philosophy, moved in overlapping social circles, though again the historical record does not allow us to reconstruct specific conversations with certainty. What the record does allow us to say clearly is that Bruno was a significant presence in London intellectual life during these 2 years, and that the ideas he was circulating found their way into the culture in ways that cannot always be traced to a specific point of origin. By 1585, it was time to move again. The French ambassador, whose protection had sheltered him, was recalled to France, and with his departure, the diplomatic cover that had made London livable was gone. He left London in the summer of 1585. He crossed the Channel again, back into the turbulent politics of Catholic Europe, carrying with him the books he had written and the reputation those books had built. He was 37 years old. He had been running for 9 years. He was not finished running. But something had changed. The ideas were out in the world now, in print, in circulation. No longer just the contents of a single mind, but permanent objects in the world that could be read and argued about and built upon by people he would never meet in places he would never go. Whatever happened to the man from this point forward? The books were beyond the reach of any institution that might want to undo them. The Thames moved south toward the sea behind him as the boat pulled away from the dock. He did not look back. Chapter 6. The Wanderer Returns. Wittenberg to Frankfurt, 1585 to 1591. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that does not come from the body. It comes from the accumulation of departures, from the specific weight of having left too many cities, packed too many rooms, said goodbye to too many people who were not quite friends, but were the closest thing available in a life that did not allow for the kind of rootedness that real friendship requires. It comes from the knowledge, arrived at slowly, and then all at once, that the next city is not going to be different in the ways that matter most. By the time Bruno crossed back into continental Europe in the summer of 1585, he had been living this way for 9 years. 9 years of temporary rooms and temporary appointments, and the particular social performance required of a man who is always the stranger, always explaining himself, always negotiating his presence in a world that has not made a permanent place for him. He was 37 years old and tired in the way that does not show on the face but lives behind the eyes. He went back to Paris first, because Paris was the closest thing he had to a home base on the continent. The Paris he returned to was worse than the one he had left. The Catholic League, backed by Spain and dedicated to the elimination of Protestant influence in France, had consolidated its hold over much of the country and was pressing Henri III with increasing aggression. The king was caught between the League on one side and the Protestant Huguenots on the other, with diminishing room to manoeuvre and diminishing political capital to spend on the protection of foreign intellectuals with heterodox opinions. Bruno met with Henri. The meeting was cordial but unproductive. The king was sympathetic, but managing a political crisis that left little room for the kind of sustained patronage he had offered 4 years earlier. Bruno could not get the appointment he needed. He moved to the German states. The German-speaking lands of the late 16th century were a patchwork of principalities and city-states operating under the theoretical authority of the Holy Roman Empire, each one with its own religious settlement and its own tolerance for intellectual deviance. For Bruno, this fragmentation was both an opportunity and a limitation. An opportunity because there were enough different jurisdictions that he could move between them when one became uncomfortable. A limitation because no single place was likely to offer the permanent position his work required. He went to Wittenberg first. Wittenberg was the city where Martin Luther had posted his 95 Theses on the door of the castle church in 1517. The act that most people identify as the beginning of the Reformation. The University of Wittenberg offered Bruno a position as a lecturer in 1586 that he held for 2 years. And those years were among the more stable of his wandering period. The Lutheran scholars were not Dominicans. They had their own orthodoxies. But those orthodoxies were sufficiently different from the Catholic ones that Bruno's particular deviations were less immediately threatening. He wrote during these years with the productivity that stability allowed. He published further works on memory and on his philosophical system. He delivered a notable farewell address when he left Wittenberg in 1588, an oration that was received warmly and that reflected his genuine appreciation for the 2 years of relative peace the city had given him. Reading that farewell address across the centuries, what comes through is not only gratitude, it is the specific warmth of a man who has been welcomed somewhere, who has allowed himself to feel at home, and who knows he is about to leave, and has not yet decided whether that knowledge is grief or simply the familiar weight of a life that has always been organized around departure. But the stability was always temporary. The political winds shifted. A new elector came to power with a different religious orientation, and the climate of Wittenberg changed in the way he had learned to recognize, in the slight alteration of how people greeted him, in conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He went to Prague. The imperial capital was presided over by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, a man whose interest in alchemy, astrology, and the occult sciences had made his court one of the most unusual intellectual environments in Europe. Rudolf collected things, artworks, scholars, scientists, magicians, and astrologers, creating around himself a court where the boundaries between natural philosophy and occult investigation were unusually permeable. Bruno arrived with a work on geometry and natural philosophy dedicated to Rudolf. Hoping to secure imperial patronage, he received a modest one-time payment for the dedication, considerably short of the sustained appointment he was looking for. He spent a few months in Prague and moved on. He went to Helmstedt, another Lutheran university city, where he received another appointment and spent another relatively productive year before the pattern repeated itself. He was excommunicated by the local Lutheran superintendent, less because of a serious theological investigation than because of a general institutional discomfort with someone who did not fit neatly into the available categories. The excommunication was lifted after he made the appropriate representations, but the experience confirmed what he already knew. He went to Frankfurt. Frankfurt was not a university city. It was a commercial city, one of the most important in Europe, the site of the great book fair that twice a year drew publishers and booksellers and authors from across the continent. It was a city whose identity was built on trade, and whose culture was correspondingly more pragmatic and less ideologically rigid than the university cities he had been moving through. He stayed with a printer named Johann Weckel, who published philosophical and scientific works, and during his time in Frankfurt he arranged for the publication of 3 substantial Latin works, De Triplici Minimo, De Monade, and De Menso, written and prepared for publication around 1590 and 1591. These were dense and ambitious, covering the full range of his thought, from his theory of matter to his cosmological vision to his philosophical account of the divine principle animating the whole. They were the permanent record of a complete philosophical system, the kind of work intended to outlast the man who wrote it. He seemed to understand, in Frankfurt, that the time for speaking for himself directly might be running out. The letters he wrote during this period, preserved in various archives and examined carefully by scholars including Hilary Gatti, whose work on Bruno's philosophy, published in 1999, remains one of the most thorough analyses of his thought, suggest a man increasingly aware of his own exhaustion and increasingly uncertain about the future. He was 42 years old. He had been moving for 15 years. He had written more books than most scholars produce in a lifetime, and had not yet produced the one thing he needed most: a permanent position in a place that could hold him. And then the invitation came. A young Venetian nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo had read Bruno's works on memory and written to him in Frankfurt, expressing interest in becoming his student. Mocenigo was wealthy and well connected, from one of the oldest and most powerful families in Venice, and he offered Bruno accommodation in his palazzo and payment for instruction in the memory arts. Venice was not Rome. The Republic of Venice had a long tradition of independence from direct papal authority and its Inquisition, while real operated with somewhat less ferocity than the Roman one. The city was wealthy and sophisticated and internationally connected. Bruno looked at the invitation and felt something shift. He had been away from Italy for 15 years, away from the warmth of the Italian south, away from the language that was his own, in a way that Latin and French and German never quite were. He was tired of moving. He was tired of being always the stranger, in a city whose social codes he was always in the process of decoding from scratch. There was also, the scholars suggest, something else. There is evidence in the documents that survive from this period that Bruno had begun to entertain a hope that had no foundation in anything the previous 15 years had demonstrated. The hope that the Church might be persuaded, that the ideas he had been developing and publishing for 15 years might be presented to the right audience in the right way, and might be recognized, not as heresy, but as a more adequate theology than the one the Church was defending. He had dedicated books to popes. He had framed his philosophy, consistently and sincerely, as a vision of God whose greatness was expressed through the infinite rather than constrained by the finite. He may have believed that this argument, properly made, could work. He may have believed that he could come home. He accepted Mocenigo's invitation. He packed his books and his manuscripts and whatever else a man accumulates in 15 years of wandering, and he travelled south through the Alps toward Venice. The Alps in autumn are extraordinary, the kind of landscape that makes the smallness of human concerns feel temporarily true rather than merely theoretical. Snow on the high passes, the valleys below still green, the sky very blue and very cold. He crossed them going south. He was going home. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the hope and the 15 years of accumulated departures, the question that had been organizing his life since childhood was still there, still intact, still reaching toward the same horizon it had always been reaching toward. The universe is larger than any story we have been given about it. He still believed that. He would always believe that. What he did not yet know was that believing it, in the city that was waiting for him at the bottom of those mountains, was going to cost him everything that remained. Chapter 7. The Invitation and the Trap. Venice, 1591 to 1592. He saw the city for the first time from the water. That is how everyone sees Venice for the first time, arriving by boat across the lagoon. And the experience in the 16th century was, if anything, more disorienting than it is today, because there was nothing else like it in the world. A city built on water, its palaces rising directly from the surface of the lagoon, as if the architects had decided that the ordinary rules of construction, the requirement that buildings rest on solid ground, were suggestions rather than laws. The light in Venice is different from the light anywhere else in Italy, reflected off the water in a way that softens everything and makes the whole city seem slightly unreal, slightly provisional, as if it might one day simply settle back into the lagoon from which it had been improbably raised. Bruno stood at the bow of the boat and looked at it. He was 43 years old. He had been away from Italy for 15 years. The smell of the lagoon, salt and mud, and the particular organic richness of a body of water that has had a city built on top of it for centuries, was the smell of home in a way that no city in France or England or Germany had ever been. The language he heard from the boatman was Italian, the language in which he had written his most important books, the language in which he thought most naturally. He had come home. He allowed himself to feel that, fully, for a moment, before the other thoughts could arrive. He was home. The palazzo of Giovanni Mocenigo sat on a canal not far from the centre of the city, a large and well-appointed residence that reflected the standing of one of Venice's most ancient, noble families. Mocenigo received Bruno with the enthusiasm of a man who has been looking forward to something for a long time, and is pleased to find that the reality matches the anticipation. He was 29 years old, well dressed, confident in the particular way of people who have never had to be anything other than confident. And he wanted what he had always wanted from this arrangement. He wanted the secrets of memory. To understand Giovanni Mocenigo properly, it is important to understand what he was not. He was not a scholar. He was not driven by the kind of genuine intellectual curiosity that had brought other patrons to Bruno's door across the years of wandering. He had read enough of Bruno's published works on memory to understand that the system was extraordinary, that it could do things with information that ordinary minds could not. And he had decided, with the pragmatic calculation of a man accustomed to acquiring useful things, that he wanted it. Not the philosophy behind it, not the cosmological vision that Bruno had built around the memory techniques, the infinite universe and the divine principle animating the whole. He wanted the practical tool, the rotating wheels of images, the architectural method for holding vast quantities of information in an organized mind. And he wanted it because, in the world of Venetian noble politics, where the ability to recall names and facts and the contents of conversations with precision was a genuine form of social and political power, such a tool had obvious value. He wanted the lock picked. He had no interest in the door it opened. Bruno moved into the palazzo and began teaching. The arrangement was functional, if not entirely comfortable. Mocenigo was a demanding student who expected rapid results, and who had the particular frustration of a wealthy man who has been told that something is possible and cannot understand why it is not immediately available to him. He wanted mastery in weeks. The memory system required months of foundational work before the advanced techniques became accessible, and the gap between what Mocenigo expected and what Bruno could deliver in the time frame Mocenigo had imagined began to generate friction almost from the beginning. But Bruno talked. He could not help it. It was the same compulsion that had animated every city he had lived in since Naples. The inability to hold the argument at the point where it was safe. The need to follow it to where it actually went. In the evenings in Mocenigo's palazzo, over meals, and in conversation, Bruno talked about his ideas, the infinite universe, the multiple worlds, the nature of the divine, the inadequacy of orthodox doctrine as an honest account of what God actually was. Mocenigo listened. He took notes. The notes were not the record of a student trying to understand a teacher. They were the record of a man assembling a case. The historians who have examined this period most carefully, including Ingrid Rowland in her biography of Bruno, Note that Mocenigo's behaviour across the months of Bruno's residence has the specific texture of an instrumental calculation rather than a spontaneous betrayal. He was not a man who had welcomed Bruno into his home in good faith, and then been shocked by what he heard. The evidence suggests he had been gathering material from relatively early in the arrangement, building a file with the patience of someone who understood that the value of what he was collecting depended on its completeness. What drove him to this is a question the historical record answers only partially. Anger at feeling cheated of the deepest secrets of the memory system almost certainly played a role. A man of his social standing and his particular kind of pride does not easily accept the experience of having paid for something and received less than he believed he was promised. Fear may also have played a role. The fear of a man who has allowed into his house someone with Bruno's reputation and who understands that housing such a person without reporting him carries its own institutional risks. And perhaps something simpler than either of these. Perhaps he simply saw an opportunity and took it. The relationship deteriorated in the winter of 1591 to 1592. By the spring of 1592, Bruno was making plans to leave Venice and travel to Frankfurt again for the book fair, where he had further publications in progress. When he told Mocenigo this, the mask came off. On the night of May 22nd, 1592, Mocenigo summoned Bruno to a room in the palazzo and told him he would not be leaving. When Bruno attempted to leave anyway, the doors had been locked from the outside. He was placed under guard in his room. The following morning, Mocenigo appeared before the Venetian Inquisition and presented a written denunciation of Giordano Bruno, drawing on the notes he had been keeping across the months of their arrangement. The denunciation was detailed and specific. It listed statements that Bruno had allegedly made about Christ, about the Trinity, about the nature of God, about the structure of the universe. Many were recognizable versions of positions he had been publishing for 15 years. Some were more extreme than anything he had put in print, and whether those reflected things he had actually said or elaborations by Mocenigo is a question that scholars have not been able to resolve definitively from the surviving documents. Bruno was arrested and brought before the Venetian Inquisition. The hearings that followed over the next several months were conducted with the particular combination of procedural formality and genuine menace that characterized inquisitorial proceedings. Bruno engaged with them with a sophistication that reflected his years of living inside the structures of the Church, distinguishing between the positions he had published, which he defended as philosophical speculation rather than doctrinal assertion, and the more extreme statements Mocenigo had attributed to him, which he denied or explained as misunderstandings. He attempted to draw a line between philosophical inquiry, which he argued was a legitimate activity that did not require the advance approval of theological authority, and heretical belief, which he acknowledged was a serious matter subject to the Church's jurisdiction. For a time it seemed possible that the matter might be resolved in Venice with a formal retraction and a period of penance. The Venetian political context gave the proceedings a slightly different character than they would have had in Rome itself. There were moments when the institutional machinery seemed inclined toward resolution rather than escalation. But Rome was watching. The Roman Inquisition had been tracking Bruno for years, had accumulated its own file on him from the reports generated by his travels across Europe, and it wanted him. In January of 1593, Rome formally requested the transfer of Giordano Bruno. The Venetian authorities deliberated. They had their own interests and their own tradition of not simply doing what Rome told them to do. But the charges were serious, and the political cost of refusing Rome's request on behalf of a foreign philosopher who had been in the city for less than a year was more than the Republic was willing to pay. They handed him over. Bruno was taken from Venice to Rome in February of 1593, transported under guard through the Italian countryside in the depths of winter, delivered to the prison of the Roman Inquisition. He would not leave Rome for the rest of his life. Somewhere on that road south, in the cold of a February that showed no interest in being anything other than cold, he would have had time to understand what the transfer meant. Not with certainty. He had survived difficult situations before, but with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to read the signals of institutional machinery, and who can feel, in the particular combination of signals surrounding them now, that this situation is different from the ones that came before. The door of the Roman prison closed. The winter pressed against the walls, and Giordano Bruno, who had been running for 15 years, found that he had run out of road. Chapter 8. 7 Years in the Dark. Rome, 1593 to 1599. The Castel Sant'Angelo sits on the bank of the Tiber River in Rome, a massive circular structure that had been, over its long history, a mausoleum for Roman emperors, a fortress for medieval popes, and a prison for people the Church needed to hold securely while it decided what to do with them. It was connected to the Vatican by a covered elevated walkway built so that popes could move between the two structures quickly in times of danger. And the connection was not merely architectural. The castle and the Vatican were parts of the same system, and the people held in one were held there at the decision of the people who inhabited the other. Bruno arrived in February of 1593 and was placed in a cell. The primary method of the Roman Inquisition was not spectacular violence. It was time, isolation, the slow pressure of repeated questioning over months and years, designed to wear down the will of a prisoner by surrounding him with the machinery of institutional authority and waiting for the point at which continued resistance ceased to seem worth the cost. For most people, that point arrived relatively quickly. For Giordano Bruno, it did not arrive for 7 years. The records of his trial, portions of which survived and were examined by the historian Luigi Firpo in his essential reconstruction of the proceedings published in 1993, give us a picture of those years that is fragmentary but revealing. The complete trial documents were lost, possibly destroyed in the transfer of Vatican archives to Paris during the Napoleonic period. But enough survives in secondary sources and in the summaries produced by the inquisitors themselves to understand the broad shape of what happened. The proceedings were conducted by a committee of cardinals that included, at various points, some of the most powerful figures in the Roman Church. Robert Bellarmine, later canonized as a saint and recognized as one of the greatest theological minds of the Counter-Reformation, was among those who examined Bruno. Bellarmine was 41 years old when the Bruno proceedings began in Rome, at the height of his considerable powers, and he was not what Bruno had encountered before in any institutional confrontation. The Dominican superiors in Naples had been unsettled by Bruno's questions. The Calvinist authorities in Geneva had been irritated by them. The various Lutheran superintendents along the road had been confused by them. Bellarmine was none of these things. He had read the books. He grasped the unified philosophical vision behind the individual propositions. He understood exactly what Bruno was saying, what it meant for Christian doctrine at its foundations, and why no partial concession on Bruno's part would be sufficient to resolve the problem at its root. This is what made the 7 years something more than a bureaucratic process. Imagine two men sitting across from each other in a room in Rome. One of them has spent 30 years following an idea about the nature of the universe through every country in Europe, has been imprisoned for it, has watched the idea take him to the edges of everything he had and still cannot put it down. The other has spent 30 years building and defending the intellectual framework of a church that understands, with complete clarity, why that idea cannot be permitted to stand. Both men are intelligent. Both men are sincere. Both men understand the full scope of what is at stake. Between them is a gap that no argument can bridge, because the gap is not about the details of the argument. It is about where the authority to settle arguments resides. Bellarmine believed that the authority of the Church to determine the limits of acceptable theological speculation was itself a theological truth, not merely an institutional convenience. A man who reserved the right to decide for himself what was true about God had placed his own judgment above the authority of the institution that Christ had established to transmit divine truth to humanity. That was the central error, the one that had to be corrected before anything else could be addressed. Bruno's position was the precise mirror image. The pursuit of truth was itself a religious obligation. A God of infinite intelligence could not be honoured by the deliberate limitation of human inquiry. The authority of the Church was legitimate in the domain of faith and practice, but had no standing to dictate the conclusions of philosophical investigation into the nature of the cosmos. These two positions cannot be reconciled. They cannot be negotiated into compatibility. They describe, from opposite sides, the same fundamental disagreement about where authority over truth resides, a disagreement so fundamental that every exchange between the two men, however formally conducted, however procedurally correct, was always going to end in the same place. The Inquisition kept hoping that the next session would be the one in which Bruno finally came to understand that the cost of his refusal was greater than the value of what he was refusing to surrender. Bruno kept engaging with the process, drawing distinctions, seeking formulations that were true enough to satisfy his own conscience and acceptable enough to satisfy the institution, without finding the one that satisfied both simultaneously. He was willing, at various points, to acknowledge that certain of his positions had been imprudent. He was willing to express regret for the scandal his writings had caused. He was willing to reframe some of his philosophical claims as speculative rather than doctrinal. What he was not willing to do was say that the universe was finite, that the stars were not suns, that there were no other worlds. He was not willing to say these things because he believed they were false, and the falseness of them was not something he could pretend not to know. He had been following the implications of that knowledge for his entire adult life. To retract it would not have been a legal manoeuvre. It would have been the erasure of everything he was. The scholar, John Bossi, in his work on Bruno, published in 1991, describes the 7 years of proceedings as a prolonged negotiation between a man who could not surrender the core of his vision and an institution that could not accept anything less than full surrender. Now, pause here for a moment, because this matters for us in a way that goes beyond the 16th century. We live in a world where the pressure to soften what we actually think, to round off the edges of our honest assessment of things, to present a version of our beliefs that is acceptable to whoever holds power over the next step in our lives, is not usually delivered with the directness of an inquisition. It comes more softly, through the accumulated signals of what gets rewarded and what gets penalized, through the gradual understanding that the version of yourself that asks the difficult question is the version that makes things harder. Bruno sat in a cell in Rome for 7 years and was offered, repeatedly, the softer version of himself, the version that would acknowledge the Church's authority over the conclusions of his inquiry, the version that would allow him to leave the prison and live out his remaining years in whatever peace a man of his temperament was capable of. He did not take it. Not because he was incapable of compromise. The record of the proceedings makes clear that he tried, repeatedly, to find the formulation that would allow him to be honest and survive simultaneously. He could not find it, because the one thing the institution required was the one thing he could not give: the acknowledgement that the authority to decide what was true belonged to someone other than the argument itself. His health suffered across those 7 years. Imprisonment in a 16th century cell took a physical toll that the documents acknowledge in passing references to his condition. He was a man in his 40s and then his early 50s, spending his most intellectually productive years in a room, arguing with people who had the power to kill him about questions he had been arguing about his entire life. And yet the quality of his arguments in the later proceedings, as reconstructed from the surviving fragments, suggests a mind that had not been dulled by the years of confinement, but had, if anything, been clarified by them. When everything else is stripped away, what remains is what has always been most essential. For Bruno, what remained was the argument itself, as precise and as complete as it had ever been. By 1597 and 1598, the proceedings had reached a genuine crisis. The inquisitors presented Bruno with a formal ultimatum, laying out the propositions they had identified as heretical and requiring a complete and unqualified retraction of each one. Bruno asked for time to consider. He was given time. He came back with a response the inquisitors found insufficient. He was given more time. He came back again, still insufficient. In January of 1600, after a final series of hearings, the Committee of Cardinals reached a conclusion. He was condemned as an impenitent heretic. The sentence was prepared and read to him in February of 1600. By the account of Gaspar Schopp, a German scholar who witnessed the proceedings and recorded them in a letter written shortly afterward, one of the few surviving first-hand descriptions of this moment, Bruno listened to the sentence without visible collapse, and responded that perhaps those who pronounced his sentence did so with greater fear than he felt in receiving it. Schopp's account is a single witness, writing from memory shortly after the event, and we should hold those specific words with the appropriate care that single-source accounts require. What the account conveys, and what is consistent with everything else we know about how Bruno conducted himself across 3 decades, is a man who had decided, long before this morning, where he stood and what he was willing to pay for standing there. He was 52 years old. He had been in Roman custody for 7 years. He had been carrying the infinite universe inside him since he was a boy lying in a field outside Nola. The sentence was pronounced. The fire was waiting. Chapter 9. The 8 Heresies. Rome, 1599 to 1600. Before we arrive at the square, we need to stop here. The story of Giordano Bruno has been told, in its popular versions, in a way that is simpler than the truth. And the simplification does a disservice not only to the historical record, but to Bruno himself. The simple version goes like this. Bruno said the earth moved around the sun. Bruno said the universe was infinite. The church burned him for being a scientist. This version is not false exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. And incompleteness in a story like this one is its own kind of dishonesty. The 8 propositions that the Roman Inquisition identified as heretical in Bruno's work were not 8 propositions about astronomy. Some of them touched on cosmology, most of them did not. The complete list of the 8 propositions has not survived in the trial documents, because the trial documents were lost. What historians have been able to reconstruct, drawing on the work of Luigi Firpo and on a document known as the Summary of the Trial, discovered in the Vatican archives in 1940 by the historian Angelo Mercati and published after his death, gives us a partial but informative picture of what those propositions involved. The first and most discussed concerned the nature of the universe. Bruno had argued, in print and apparently in his conversations with the inquisitors, that the universe was infinite, that it contained an infinite number of worlds, and that many of those worlds might be inhabited by rational beings. The theological problem with this position was not simply that it contradicted Aristotle. The deeper problem was what it implied about the uniqueness of the Incarnation. Christian doctrine held that God had become human in the person of Jesus Christ, born in a specific place at a specific time, living and dying and rising from the dead in an event central to the entire structure of Christian theology. If there were infinite worlds populated by rational beings, what was their relationship to this event? Had Christ been incarnated on each of those worlds? Were the rational beings on other worlds excluded from the salvation the Incarnation was supposed to make available? These were not trivial questions from a theological perspective. They went to the heart of what Christianity claimed about the relationship between God and humanity, and Bruno's cosmology made them impossible to answer within the existing framework. His own response to this problem was to reframe the entire question, arguing for a vision of the divine that did not depend on specific historical events at all, a God whose infinite nature expressed itself through the infinite variety of the natural world. This was theological territory the Inquisition found more alarming than the cosmology alone. The second cluster of propositions concerned the nature of Christ directly. Bruno had expressed doubts about certain foundational doctrines. He had questioned, according to the reconstructed trial record, the virgin birth. He had questioned transubstantiation, the Catholic teaching that the bread and wine of the Eucharist were literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ during the Mass. These positions placed him in territory that was not merely philosophically heterodox, but doctrinally heretical in the most direct sense. The divinity of Christ and the reality of the sacraments were not peripheral matters. They were the foundational doctrines that centuries of theological work had defined and defended. The third area involved the nature of the soul. Bruno had argued for a vision of the soul's relationship to the body, influenced by his philosophical account of matter. His position was complex, drawing on ancient philosophical sources to describe a cosmos in which what we call the soul was part of the continuous animate principle flowing through everything, rather than a separate, immaterial substance that existed independently of the body and survived its death in the manner that orthodox doctrine required. The orthodox doctrine of personal immortality was central to the entire structure of Christian teaching about what happened after death. Bruno's position did not deny the soul's reality, but it described its existence in terms that made the standard doctrinal account unrecognizable. The fourth area, and in some ways the most politically sensitive, concerned the practice of magic. Bruno had been associated throughout his career with the magical tradition of the Renaissance, the body of theory and practice that sought to work with the spiritual forces that Neoplatonic philosophy described as animating the natural world. His memory system was not, in his own account of it, simply a technique for organizing information. It was a way of aligning the human mind with the structural principles of the cosmos. The Inquisition's concern with this dimension of his work was both theological and practical. Theologically, the invocation of spiritual forces outside the sanctioned channels of the Church was potentially dangerous. Practically, it represented a form of knowledge and power operating entirely outside institutional oversight. Now, with these propositions laid out, it is necessary to say something that the popular account of Bruno's story almost never says. He was not executed primarily because he said the earth moved around the sun. Galileo said the earth moved around the sun, in a much more public and scientifically rigorous way than Bruno. And the Inquisition's response to Galileo was house arrest and a formal recantation, not execution. The difference in treatment reflects, among other things, the difference in what the two men were actually saying. Galileo was making a carefully framed claim about the physical structure of the solar system based on observational evidence. Bruno was making claims about Christ, about the soul, about the nature of the divine, about the authority of the Church to determine the limits of philosophical inquiry, and he was making them in a way that was explicitly theological, explicitly challenging to the foundations of the institutional Church, and explicitly resistant to the kind of compromise that might have saved him. This does not mean Bruno deserved to die. It means the story is more complicated than the simple version allows. And the complication matters for understanding both what he was actually arguing and why the institution found it so threatening. The scholar Ingrid Rowland, in her biography published in 2008, argues that the combination of cosmological and theological heterodoxy in Bruno's work created a profile that the Inquisition found genuinely alarming in a way that purely cosmological deviance would not have. He was not simply a scientist with wrong ideas about the solar system. He was a systematic thinker whose entire philosophical vision, taken as a whole, constituted an alternative account of God, the soul, and the cosmos that was incompatible with Christian orthodoxy at the most fundamental level, and he knew it. He had always known it. The years in San Domenico had given him a theological education thorough enough that he understood precisely where his ideas departed from the standard account. He was not an innocent who had stumbled into heresy without realizing it. He was a philosopher who had followed his reasoning where it led and who had been clear-eyed, from at least his mid-20s, about what that following was going to cost. Which brings us back to the question that the 7 years of proceedings make unavoidable. Why did he not simply retract? The answer Bruno gave, in various formulations across the years of his imprisonment, was that he could not retract what he believed to be true without sinning against the truth itself. To say that the universe was finite when he believed it was not was not merely an intellectual concession. It was a violation of the deepest commitment of his entire life. There is also the question of what retraction would actually have saved. The retraction being demanded was not simply a statement about cosmology. It was a retraction of the entire philosophical vision, of the account of God and the soul and the relationship between mind and cosmos that Bruno had been developing since his years in Naples. To retract it would have been to declare that the person he had been for 30 years did not exist and had not existed. Some people can do this. Some people, faced with the alternative, find that the self they are being asked to erase is not worth more than the life they are being offered in exchange for it. Bruno found that it was. In January of 1600, the Committee of Cardinals reached their conclusion. He was condemned as an impenitent heretic. The sentence was prepared. Bellarmine read it to him. And whatever Gaspar Schopp recorded of that moment, whatever Bruno said or did not say in the room where the sentence was pronounced, what the entire record of his life tells us is this. He had been offered the exit at dozens of points across 30 years. He had not taken any of them. He was not going to take this one either. The fire was waiting in the square. He was ready. Chapter 10. Campo de Fiori. Rome, February 17th, 1600. The square called Campo dei Fiori, which means Field of Flowers in Italian, sits in the heart of old Rome, a few minutes' walk from the Tiber River. In the 16th century, it was one of the main public spaces of the city, a place where markets were held and public announcements were made, and, on the occasions when the authorities determined that a public demonstration of institutional power was required, executions were carried out. On the morning of February 17th, 1600, the market stalls were not there. The square had been prepared for something else. Bruno had been held in the Castel Sant'Angelo for the final weeks following his sentencing, given additional opportunities to recant and time for the institutional paperwork required for the transfer of a convicted heretic to the secular authorities to be completed. The transfer to secular authorities was not a formality in the moral sense. Though it was presented as one, the Church did not, technically, execute people. What the Church did was determine that a person was a heretic and declare them outside its protection, at which point the secular authorities of the state took custody of them and carried out whatever punishment the secular law prescribed for the crime of heresy. The secular law prescribed death. This distinction was understood by everyone involved to be a distinction without a practical difference. It was maintained because the institutional identity of the Church required it. He was brought to the square in the early morning. The execution of a condemned heretic was a public event by design. The assembled crowd was meant to witness the consequence of the kind of thinking Bruno had done, to understand viscerally that there were limits to what a person could think and say and write without risking everything. A crucifix was brought to him, a final offer of reconciliation that the Church maintained was available even at this last moment. According to the account of Gaspar Schopp, writing to a colleague in the days following the execution, and bearing in mind that this is a single witness account written from memory shortly after the event, Bruno turned his face away from it. The fire was lit. Later accounts, drawn primarily from Schopp's letter, emphasized that Bruno met the end without visible collapse. that he did not perform the public remorse the institution had been trying to extract from him for 7 years. The exact details of his final moments remain limited to what a single witness chose to record, and we should hold those details with the appropriate care that single-source accounts require. What the accounts convey, taken together with everything else we know about how Bruno conducted himself across 3 decades, is consistent with a man who had already finished his argument. There was nothing left to take back. When it was over, the authorities made one final decision that tells you as much about their fear as anything else in the story. They gathered his ashes and threw them into the Tiber River. The reason was practical and symbolic simultaneously. A martyr requires a body. A body can be buried, and a grave can become a site of pilgrimage. A place where people gather to remember and to honour and to continue the argument the execution was supposed to end. By throwing the ashes into the river, the authorities ensured there would be no grave, no fixed point around which memory could organise itself, no physical remainder of the man to anchor the idea to a place. The river took the ashes south toward the sea. The Tiber did not care what it carried. The city went on around the square, in the way that cities go on around the places where terrible things have happened, with the particular resilience of places that have absorbed enough history to have stopped being surprised by it. The market would return to Campo de Fiori the following week. People would buy vegetables and fish and whatever else the market sold, in the same square where the fire had been, on ground that still held the memory of what had been done there, even as the daily life of the city moved across it without pausing. But something had changed that morning that the disposal of the ashes could not undo. The books were already out in the world. The Ash Wednesday supper was in libraries across Europe. On the Infinite Universe and Worlds was on shelves in Paris and London and Frankfurt and Prague. The 3 Latin works were in the hands of readers in the German states and the Netherlands and England. The ideas that Bruno had spent 30 years developing had left the single mind that generated them and entered the general circulation of European thought, where they would continue to work on the people who encountered them, regardless of what had happened to the man who first put them into print. The institution had calculated that killing the man would kill the idea. Ideas do not have bodies to be burned or ashes to be scattered. They persist in the minds of the people who have encountered them, and those people pass them to other people. And the chain of transmission continues, regardless of what happens to the original source. In the months following February 17th, 1600, the books circulated with an intensity they had not quite had before, because now they were the books of a man who had died for them. The martyrdom, which the Church had hoped would discredit the ideas by associating them with the fate of their author, had instead given them a gravity they had not possessed when Bruno was merely a living fugitive. Death had made him permanently present in the argument. The stars above Campo de Fiori burned on that morning as they had burned through everything that had happened in that city across its long and extraordinary history, doing what Bruno had spent his life saying they were doing, burning, each one a sun, each one indifferent to the small argument being made on one small world about whether anyone was allowed to say so. Chapter 11. The Long Silence and the Slow Vindication. Rome to the present. 1600 to now. When the fire went out in Campo de Fiori on the morning of February 17th, 1600, the immediate response of the world was not vindication. It was silence. Not the silence of a world that had not noticed what happened. The particular silence of a world that had noticed, had drawn the obvious conclusion about what happened to people who said certain things, and had decided, with the rational caution that self-preservation produces, to keep its own counsel about how it felt. The silence was most eloquent in the people who had most reason to speak. Galileo Galilei was 35 years old when Bruno was executed in Rome, already established as a mathematician and natural philosopher of considerable promise, already working with the questions about motion and the structure of the solar system that would eventually make him the most famous scientist in Europe. He never mentioned Bruno by name in any of his published works, not once. In the years when he was defending the Copernican system before the very same institution that had burned Bruno, he was scrupulous about maintaining the distance between his own carefully empirical argument and the broader philosophical claims that had gotten Bruno killed. This silence has been interpreted by some historians as cowardice, and by others as strategic wisdom. The distinction may not be as clear as it seems. Galileo understood that invoking Bruno was among the most effective ways to ensure his own work would be suppressed before it could be read. He kept the name out. The science moved forward. But it left Bruno in a peculiar position in the history of ideas. He had reached toward some of the most consequential cosmological intuitions of the scientific revolution, a generation before the scientific revolution, and had been largely erased from the official story of that revolution by the people who carried it forward, partly because invoking him was dangerous, and partly because his way of arriving at his conclusions was so different from the empirical method that the revolution was building its identity around. Bruno had not used a telescope. He had not made systematic observations. He had reached toward his picture of the infinite universe through philosophical reasoning and intuition, rather than through the kind of empirical investigation that would become the foundation of modern science. The new science that Galileo and Johannes Kepler and later Isaac Newton were constructing was explicitly building itself on the rejection of reasoning and intuition as sufficient grounds for scientific claims. Evidence was required. Observation was required. Bruno's intuitions were, in their direction and in their broad conclusions, pointing towards something that modern astronomy would later confirm. The stars were not lamps on a crystalline shell. They were suns, distributed through space at vastly varying distances, some of them potentially surrounded by worlds of their own. In that astonishing respect, he had reached towards something real before anyone had the tools to verify it. But the path he took to get there was not the path science was building, and that distinction mattered enormously to the people building it. Newton, working in England in the second half of the 17th century, built the mathematical framework for a universe recognizable in its broad outlines as the universe Bruno had pointed toward. Newtonian physics operated in infinite space. The stars in Newton's universe were suns, each one potentially a centre of its own gravitational system. Newton was as careful as Galileo about Bruno. The intellectual genealogy he constructed for his work ran through Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo. The figures whose methods matched the empirical framework he was completing. Bruno was not in that genealogy. The silence held through most of the 17th century and into the 18th. Then, slowly, the silence began to break. It broke first in the philosophical tradition, and it broke quietly. The way things tend to break, when the people breaking them are still somewhat cautious about what they are doing. The philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz engaged with Bruno's ideas with more openness than his predecessors had shown. Baruch Spinoza, working in the Netherlands in the middle of the 17th century, developed a philosophical vision of God and nature that had structural parallels to Bruno's own. A universe in which the divine principle expressed itself through the infinite variety of natural things rather than operating from outside them. Neither man cited Bruno directly, but the relationship between their positions and his has been a subject of ongoing scholarly attention. What is worth pausing on here, in the middle of this long account of intellectual recovery, is how slow the process was. Not years, not decades, centuries. The people who might have spoken up in 1601 or 1605 or 1620 did not speak up, because the machinery that had burned Bruno was still running. They made their calculations about what could be said and what could not be said, and they adjusted accordingly. And the adjustment was not always cowardice. Sometimes it was the reasonable decision of people who understood that the argument needed to survive in order to eventually be heard, and that surviving required patience. But the patience had a cost. Every generation that passed without Bruno's name being spoken openly was a generation in which the idea he had died for circulated without its history, without the knowledge of what it had cost, without the specific weight that only comes from knowing that someone paid for this with everything they had. The rehabilitation of Bruno's reputation began more visibly in the late 18th and early 19th century. The philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling published a philosophical dialogue titled Bruno in 1802. In France, the historian of philosophy Victor Cousin lectured on Bruno in the 1820s and 30s, bringing his work to the attention of a new generation of scholars. The image forming was of Bruno as a martyred hero of free thought, a man who had died for the right to follow his own reasoning to its own conclusions. This image was not false, but it was incomplete in the same way that the scientific image was incomplete. It captured one dimension of a figure who was, in reality, considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than any single image could hold. The real confirmation of the direction of Bruno's cosmological intuitions came from physics and astronomy. Slowly across the 19th and 20th centuries, parallax measurements of stellar distances, beginning in the 1830s and continuing through the 19th century, confirmed that the stars were not all at the same distance from the Earth, not all fixed to a single sphere. They were distributed through space at vastly varying distances. Spectroscopic analysis of starlight confirmed that the chemical composition of stars was consistent with their being suns of the same general kind as our own. The discovery of galaxies in the early 20th century, established definitively by the astronomer Edwin Hubble in the 1920s, showed that the Milky Way was not the whole of the universe, but one galaxy among an enormous number, each one containing hundreds of billions of stars. The universe was either actually infinite or so large that the distinction between very large and infinite makes no practical difference to anything inside it. Bruno had pointed in that direction. He had pointed there before Galileo made his first telescopic observation, before Kepler calculated the laws of planetary motion, before Newton wrote a word of his Principia. He had pointed there with no instruments, no empirical evidence, nothing but philosophical reasoning and the conviction, formed in a monastery cell in Naples by a young man reading Copernicus by candlelight, that the story the world had been given about the size of the cosmos was not large enough to hold what was actually out there. It is important to say this carefully, because precision matters here in a way it did not matter to the simplified versions of his story. Bruno was not a scientist in the modern sense, and modern cosmology is not simply a confirmation of his philosophical system. The specifics of his mechanisms, the Hermetic and Neoplatonic framework he used to explain why the universe had to be infinite, the particular philosophical machinery he built to support his cosmological intuitions. None of this corresponds to the explanations that modern physics has developed. What was confirmed was the direction, the insistence that the stars were suns, the insistence that the cosmos had no privileged centre, the intuition that the scale of what existed was incomprehensibly larger than the picture any institution had been willing to defend. He reached toward something real. He paid everything he had to keep reaching. The most visible monument of his rehabilitation came not from science or philosophy, but from politics. In 1889, on the 289th anniversary of his execution, a statue of Giordano Bruno was unveiled in Campo de Fiori. In the exact location where he had been burned, the statue, designed by the sculptor Ettore Ferrari, showed Bruno in his Dominican habit, his face partially shadowed by his hood, looking downward with an expression that the people who stood before it then and stand before it now have consistently described as carrying a specific kind of weight, not triumph, not grief, but the expression of a man who has said what he had to say and is still waiting for the world to fully hear it. Pope Leo XIII, the reigning pope at the time, expressed his deep displeasure at the erection of a monument to a heretic in the heart of Rome, and remained in the Vatican for the duration of the festivities. The crowd that gathered was enormous. The statue stands there today, and has stood there for more than 130 years, through 2 world wars, and the transformation of the surrounding city into the modern Rome that millions of visitors walk through every year. The square around it is a market on most mornings, exactly as it was in the 16th century, and the people who buy their vegetables and their flowers walk past the statue with the particular mixture of awareness and inattention that familiarity produces. In the year 2000, 400 years after his execution, the Vatican issued a statement about the Bruno case. It was not an apology. The Church's position was that the Inquisition had acted within the framework of the law and the doctrine of its time, and that the standards by which we judge such things today were not the standards available to the people who made the decisions in 1600. Cardinal Angelo Mercati described Bruno's death as a sad episode that the Church expressed regret for. The statement was received with mixed responses. Some found it adequate acknowledgement of a historical wrong. Others found it insufficient, noting that expressing regret for an episode is different from acknowledging that the episode was unjust. The debate about what the institution owes the memory of the people it silenced continues in various forms to the present day. What does not continue, because it has been settled by 4 centuries of scientific investigation, is the question of whether the direction of Bruno's cosmological intuition was pointing somewhere real. It was. The stars are suns. There are more of them than there are grains of sand on all the beaches of the earth. By the best estimates available from modern astronomy, the universe extends in every direction for distances that make the numbers used to describe them feel more like poetry than mathematics. Each of those hundreds of billions of galaxies contains hundreds of billions of stars, and around a significant fraction of those stars, the best available evidence suggests there are planets. The question of whether any of those planets host the kind of rational beings that Bruno said they might is still open. No confirmed detection of intelligent life beyond Earth has been made as of the time this was written, but the search is ongoing, conducted by scientists, working within a framework that takes the possibility seriously, rather than burning people for suggesting it. A framework that Bruno helped create at the cost of everything he had. He gave everything he had to point in a direction. The direction was real. Chapter 12. What Giordano Bruno demands of us. Rome, Campo de Fiori. A morning in the present day. The market is already busy by 7 in the morning. The vendors arrive before dawn, setting up their stalls in the same square where the fire burned 425 years ago, arranging tomatoes and zucchini and bunches of fresh herbs on wooden tables that will be packed away again by early afternoon. The smell of the market is the smell of living things, of soil still on the roots of vegetables, of fish packed in ice, of coffee from the bar on the corner where the vendors stop before setting up, warming their hands around small cups in the early morning cold. The statue stands at the centre of all of it, Giordano Bruno in his Dominican hood, looking down at the square, his face in partial shadow, his expression carrying the specific weight of a man who has been standing in this spot for 130 years, and has seen everything that has moved through the square beneath him, without once being surprised by any of it. Tourists photograph him. School children walk past him on class trips, their teachers pausing briefly to explain who he was and what happened here, compressing 4 centuries of philosophy and exile and imprisonment and fire into a few sentences before the group moves on. The vendors sell their tomatoes. The coffee bar does its morning business. And Bruno looks down from inside his stone hood with the expression of a man who has something to say and is waiting for someone to stop long enough to hear it. This chapter is about stopping long enough to hear it. Not the simplified version. Not the version that reduces him to a symbol of science versus religion, or free thought versus institutional authority. Those versions contain truth, but they contain it the way a photograph of a landscape contains the landscape, capturing the shape without the weight, the image without the experience of actually being there. Here is the first thing he demands. He demands that we take seriously the cost of following an argument where it leads. Bruno spent 30 years following a question that had begun in a field outside Nola when he was a child, and every step of that following cost him something. It cost him the monastery and the library and the institutional belonging the monastery represented. It cost him Italy for 15 years. It cost him the permanent position he spent those 15 years trying to find. It cost him his freedom for 7 years, and his life at the end. He knew the cost. He was not naive about it. The Heroic Frenzies, written in London in 1584, is, among other things, a precise account of what it feels like to be the kind of person who is seized by an impulse toward understanding that overrides the ordinary calculations of self-preservation. He described this quality in the language of love and a kind of constructive madness. The philosopher as someone possessed by a passion that the world around him does not share and cannot entirely understand, that looks from the outside like recklessness, but is, from the inside, the only available form of integrity. He was writing about himself, and the demand he makes is not that we all become him. The world does not need everyone to follow their arguments all the way to the stake. The demand is subtler and more practical than that. It is the demand that we notice when we stop following an argument, because the argument becomes uncomfortable, because it leads somewhere that threatens the position we already hold, because the conclusion it points toward is one that would cost us something to accept. Bruno could have stopped at any of a dozen points across 30 years. He could have stopped in San Domenico when his superiors first expressed concern. He could have stopped in Geneva when the Calvinist authorities required him to withdraw his criticisms. He could have stopped at any of the cities he passed through where the local version of orthodoxy made clear he had gone further than was acceptable. He could have stopped in the Roman Inquisition any time across 7 years of proceedings. He did not stop, not because he was incapable of stopping, but because he could see the argument, and he could see where it led, and he could not make himself pretend not to see it. That quality, the refusal to look away from the argument when looking away would be easier, is what he demands of us. Not his conclusions, not his cosmology. The quality of looking. Here is the second thing he demands. He demands honesty about complexity. The story of Giordano Bruno has been simplified in both directions, and both simplifications do him a disservice. The simplification that makes him purely a scientist martyred for his science leaves out the theology, the hermetic philosophy, the genuine heterodoxy about Christ and the soul and the sacraments that was as central to the Inquisition's case as the cosmology. It leaves out the fact that he was not doing science in the modern sense, that he reached toward cosmological conclusions through philosophical methods that science does not use. The simplification that makes him purely a symbol of free thought versus institutional authority leaves out the genuine theological seriousness of what he was doing. He was not simply a skeptic poking holes in religious doctrine. He was a deeply religious thinker trying to articulate a more adequate account of the divine than the one the Church was defending. A thinker who believed with complete sincerity that the infinite universe he was describing was a more honest picture of God's greatness than the finite one he was being asked to accept. The honest account has to hold both of these things simultaneously. He was a man of genuine faith and genuine heterodoxy at the same time. He was a thinker of real philosophical originality who reached toward important truths through methods that could not be empirically verified. He was a person who made the Church genuinely uncomfortable for reasons that went beyond simple disagreement about astronomy. And the Church's discomfort, while it produced a monstrous outcome, was not based on nothing. Holding this complexity is harder than choosing one simplified version and staying with it, but it is the only version that does justice to what actually happened in that square on February 17th, 1600. Here is the third thing he demands. He demands that we refuse the comfortable ending. The comfortable ending to Bruno's story goes like this. He was wrong in his time. He was right in the end. Science confirmed the direction of his intuitions. The statue was built. The Church expressed regret. The arc of history bent toward justice, and the man who had been burned in the square was eventually recognized as the visionary he was. This ending is available, and it is not false. The arc did bend. The statue was built. The science did confirm the direction. But the comfortable ending leaves out what happened between the fire in 1600 and the unveiling of the statue in 1889, and what happened in that interval is not incidental to the story, but central to it. What happened was the slow, imperfect, incomplete work of changing a world that did not want to change. The astronomers who mapped the heliocentric model did not do so in a world waiting to hear it. Galileo was put under house arrest. The books of Copernicus remained on the Index of Forbidden Books until 1835. The Index of Forbidden Books was not formally abolished until 1966. The vindication was real. It was also incomplete, contested at every stage, and achieved not through a single dramatic reversal, but through the kind of sustained, patient, unglamorous work that does not generate the same narrative energy as a burning in a public square. This is the most demanding thing Bruno asks of us, and it is demanding precisely because it has no satisfying resolution. He asks us to understand that being right is not enough, that the arc of history bends toward justice in the long run, but the long run is very long, and the bending is very slow, and the people who live in the interval between the injustice and its correction do not get to skip the interval, because they know how it eventually turns out. Bruno lived in the interval. He did not know how it turned out. From inside the cell in the Castel Sant'Angelo, with 7 years of proceedings behind him and the sentence just pronounced, there was no way to see the statue that would stand in Campo de Fiori 289 years later. No way to see the telescopes that would eventually map the universe he had pointed toward on philosophical grounds. No way to see the physics classrooms around the world where students would be taught, as settled scientific consensus, that the stars are suns, and the universe is enormous, and the earth is one world among a number that staggers the imagination. He could not see any of that. He had the argument and the fire, and the question of whether the argument was worth the fire, and he answered that question with the only answer he was capable of giving. He said yes. And the demand he makes of us, from inside that stone hood in the Campo de Fiori, is not to be him. It is not to find our own stake and walk toward it. It is something quieter and more durable than that. It is to ask, honestly and regularly, what arguments we are not following, because the following is uncomfortable, what things we can see but are choosing not to say, because the saying would cost us something, what conclusions our own best thinking points toward, that we are softening, because the actual conclusion would require us to give something up. He paid the full price of his refusal to soften. Most of us will never be asked to pay anything approaching that price. The question he asks from inside that stone hood is whether we are willing to pay the much smaller price that our own particular version of honesty requires. Not his honesty, ours, the specific, personal, daily version that has nothing to do with burning stakes and everything to do with the much smaller fires that the truth asks us to walk toward in the ordinary lives that most of us are fortunate enough to be living. Come back to the square one final time. It is evening now. The market has packed up. The vendors have gone home. The square is quiet in the way that Campo de Fiori goes quiet in the evenings. The particular blue light of a Mediterranean dusk settling over the old stones. The sounds of the city softening. The statue stands in the centre of the empty square. He is looking down at the ground where the fire was. Above him, the first stars are beginning to appear in the sky above Rome. Not all of them are visible from the city. The lights of modern Rome push the darkness back, the way the lights of every modern city push the darkness back. But they are there, behind the light pollution and the haze and the accumulated glow of millions of lives being lived simultaneously in the city below. They are there, burning with the same fire they were burning with when he first looked up at them as a boy in Nola. Each one a sun, the universe extending in every direction in a darkness so vast that the numbers used to describe it feel more like philosophy than mathematics. He spent his whole life reaching toward what was up there. He paid everything he had to keep reaching. The least we can do is look. The story of Giordano Bruno is finished for tonight. He was born without a name anyone would remember, in a small town beneath a restless mountain, and he spent the years between that beginning and the morning in Campo de Fiori following one question wherever it led, through every city that tried to hold him, and every institution that tried to stop him, and every prison door that closed behind him. The universe he reached toward is the universe you are floating through right now, on this small world circling one star among hundreds of billions, in one galaxy among hundreds of billions more, in a cosmos so large that the word large is not large enough to hold it. He intuited it before anyone had the tools to confirm it. He held to it at a cost that most of us will never be asked to pay. Let the images of this story soften now as the night settles in. The boy in the field outside Nola, the monk walking through the library before the morning bells, the fugitive on the Alpine road, the philosopher in the London embassy, writing by candlelight, the prisoner in the dark, the man in the square on a February morning, turning his face away from the crucifix and toward whatever was waiting on the other side. Let them soften at the edges, the way the images of a long day soften when the body finally allows itself to rest. You have travelled a long way tonight, from Nola to Naples, to Geneva, to Paris, to London, to Frankfurt, to Venice, to Rome. From 1548 to 1600 to 1889 to now, across 4 centuries and one extraordinary life and a universe that is as best as anyone has ever been able to determine, without end. Let your breathing slow. Let the square be quiet. Let the stars do what they have always done above wherever you are right now, burning in the dark, just as he reached toward